There is a particular kind of danger that wears a soft face, and it is the most dangerous kind precisely because it is mistaken, by the men who encounter it, for weakness. A tyrant does not fear an army massing at his border, because an army announces itself. It marches with drums and banners, and gives a man time to prepare his defenses. What a tyrant should fear, what he almost never does, until it is far too late, is the quiet woman across the dinner table who has spent a year saying nothing, learning everything, and waiting. This is the story of Clara, Duchess of Renholt, and of the year she spent being underestimated, and the single night on which the underestimating stopped. She had married Julian Ashgrave, the reigning Duke of Renholt, 12 months before this story begins, in a ceremony that had joined two of the continent's oldest financial houses and had been, by every external measure, a triumph. Clara had come from the Delacroix banking family, a lineage that had financed kings and broken them, that understood money the way generals understood terrain, and that had raised its daughters not as ornaments but as strategists, though it had done this quietly, in the old family tradition of teaching daughters everything and advertising nothing. Julian was 36, handsome in the substantial and self-satisfied way of a man who had never had cause to doubt his own judgment, and the reigning duke of a territory whose wealth and influence had been, for 2 generations, propped up by an increasingly precarious foundation of wartime loans, overextended credit, and political alliances that were more fragile than Julian believed them to be. He had married Clara for her family's money and her family's name, and had done so with the comfortable assumption, an assumption he had never examined closely enough to notice he was making, that a Delacroix daughter, raised gently and dressed exquisitely, and taught, as far as he understood it, the accomplishments appropriate to a duchess, would be precisely what she appeared to be: decorative, compliant, useful in the specific and limited sense that a beautiful signature on a marriage contract is useful. He had not thought to ask what she had actually been taught in the Delacroix nursery. He had not thought to ask why her father had insisted, unusually, that Clara retain independent control of a portion of her own dowry under continental property law, rather than surrendering it entirely to her husband's estate, as was customary. He had signed the papers without close reading, because the terms had seemed, on their surface, generous to him, and he had never in his life read a document as carefully as the people who had drafted it against him. Clara, for her part, had spent her first year of marriage doing exactly what a well-bred duchess was supposed to do. She had managed the household, hosted the appropriate dinners, worn the appropriate jewels, and smiled the appropriate smile at the appropriate moments. What no one in Renholt Palace understood, because no one had thought to look closely enough to understand it, was that she had also spent the year doing something else entirely. She had been reading, not novels, though she read those too, for the pleasure of it, in the evenings when Julian assumed she was merely resting her eyes. She had been reading the palace's ledgers, which her position as Duchess gave her nominal oversight of, and which she had used that nominal oversight to study in genuine and exhaustive depth. She had been listening, at dinners, at receptions, in the quiet corners of rooms where powerful men forgot that a duchess, with a pleasant expression, was still in fact present and possessed of ears. She had learned, over 12 months, the complete architecture of her husband's financial position, the loans taken against the estate to fund the war effort 3 years prior, the increasingly desperate borrowing against future harvests, the political alliances that were held together by favors and debts rather than genuine loyalty, and the precise degree to which the entire glittering structure of Renholt's power depended on nothing more solid than the continued good opinion of bankers, allies, and a wife everyone assumed was too gentle to ever become a problem. She had also learned, in the same 12 months, that her husband kept a mistress. Her name was Lady Genevieve Fontaine, the widowed daughter of a minor court official, vain and beautiful, and considerably less intelligent than she believed herself to be, and Julian had been visiting her with a regularity that he assumed, with the same careless confidence that governed all his assumptions. His wife knew nothing about. Clara had known for 8 months. She had said nothing. Not because she was afraid, and not because she did not feel the particular cold ache of a woman who has been quietly betrayed in her own home, but because she had understood, with the clear strategic mind her family had cultivated in her since childhood, that saying something before she was ready would accomplish nothing except to warn her opponents that she had noticed. She had watched. She had waited. She had continued to smile the appropriate smile. She was waiting, though she could not have said precisely for what, until the night of her first wedding anniversary, when Lady Genevieve Fontaine, in an act of spectacular and short-sighted vanity, decided to force the issue. The grand dining hall at Renholt Palace was filled with candlelight on the evening of the anniversary. 400 candles by the housekeeper's count, arranged with the particular extravagance that Julian favoured for occasions where his own magnificence was the intended subject. The long table was set for 12. The closest members of the Renholt inner circle, ministers and financiers and their wives, gathered to celebrate what everyone in the room understood to be a successful and advantageous marriage. Julian stood at the head of the table with a glass of the estate's finest vintage, midway through a toast that was, as his toasts generally were, considerably more about himself than about the woman he was ostensibly toasting. He was speaking of the strength of the House of Renholt, of the fortunate alliance the past year had brought, of the bright future that lay ahead for the territory under his continued and capable stewardship, when the doors at the far end of the hall opened, and a courier entered, travel-worn and slightly out of breath, carrying a heavy velvet box. The courier approached the table with the particular discomfort of a man who has been sent to deliver something he suspects he should not be delivering, and presented the box to Clara with a bow that was slightly too quick. Julian's toast trailed off mid-sentence. The table's attention, which had been politely fixed on him, turned instead to the box. Clara looked at it for a moment with the composed and pleasant expression she had worn for 12 months, and then opened it. Inside, folded with a precision that suggested it had been arranged with considerable deliberate care, was a lace nightgown, fine, expensive, unmistakably intimate, belonging, as everyone at the table would shortly understand, to Lady Genevieve Fontaine. Resting on top of it was a small card, written in an elegant and self-satisfied hand. Clara read it. The table watched her read it, the silence deepening with each second that passed, until she looked up and read it once more, and then, in a voice pitched to carry to every corner of the suddenly frozen room, read it aloud. To the Duchess, to keep you warm on the nights the Duke chooses my bed. Happy anniversary. The silence that followed was the silence of 40 candles burning and 12 people forgetting, simultaneously, how to breathe. Julian's face went the particular white of a man watching his own destruction begin and being powerless to stop its opening act. He had known, in the vague and unexamined way he knew most uncomfortable things, that Genevieve was reckless. He had not imagined she was reckless enough for this. He waited, braced, in the way a man braces for a blow he can see coming, for what he assumed would follow. The shattering of glass, the rising scream, the tears that would require him to escort his wife from the room in a humiliating and public display that would be discussed in every drawing room in the capital by morning. None of it came. Clara looked at the note for a third time, and then, slowly, with what could only be described as genuine amusement, she laughed. It was a soft sound, almost musical, entirely unlike anything Julian had heard from her in 12 months of marriage, and it was in every way more frightening than screaming would have been, because it was the laugh of a woman who has just been given something she needed and had not expected to receive quite so conveniently. She folded the note along its original creases with the same meticulous care with which it had apparently been written, and slid it into the sleeve of her gown, where it disappeared against the fabric. She looked up at Julian, who was still standing at the head of the table with his abandoned toast dying in his hand, and her expression was one of pure, glittering, icy delight. "How wonderfully efficient of her, Julian," she said, in a voice that was entirely pleasant and entirely without mercy. "She has saved me months of legal discovery." She paused and let her eyes move once around the frozen table, taking in every face, cataloguing every reaction, before returning to her husband. "Do finish your wine," she said. "You are going to need the courage for what comes next." She rose from her chair with unhurried grace. She crossed to where Julian stood, rigid and pale, and reached up to pat his cheek with a gentle, cold, entirely deliberate hand, the gesture of a woman consoling a child who has done something foolish and does not yet understand the scope of the consequence. Then she turned and walked from the hall and did not look back. Julian remained standing at the head of the table for a long moment after the doors had closed behind her, his wineglass still in his hand, the toast still unfinished, and felt, for the first time in his entire self-assured life, the sudden and primal grip of genuine fear closing around his chest. The 11 remaining guests said nothing. They did not need to. They had all just watched something extraordinary happen, and none of them, including Julian, yet understood what it was. He did not sleep that night. He told himself, lying awake in the dark of the ducal apartments, that this was simply the natural agitation of an awkward and embarrassing evening, that Clara would rage in private the way she had declined to rage in public, that the morning would bring tears and recrimination, and, eventually, the kind of frosty but manageable domestic silence that most marriages of convenience eventually settled into after a scandal of this size. The morning brought no tears. The morning brought an empty apartment. Clara was gone, not in the disordered, hasty way of a woman who has fled in distress. The household staff, when questioned, reported that the Duchess had risen early, dressed herself, and departed the palace grounds by carriage before most of the household was awake, taking with her nothing except a single locked trunk that she had personally carried to the carriage, and which no member of the staff had been permitted to touch. She had left no note. She had left no explanation. She had, according to the stable master, given instructions only that the carriage was to take her to the capital road. Julian, standing in his wife's empty apartment with the particular disorientation of a man encountering, for the first time, a consequence he had not anticipated and could not immediately manage, told himself that this was simply Clara removing herself to the family's secondary estate, the country house at Aldermore, 2 days' ride from the capital, where she had occasionally retreated for a week or two of quiet since their marriage began. He told his mother, the Dowager Duchess, this exact thing, standing in the palace's morning room, with more confidence than he actually possessed. "She is at Aldermore," he said. "She is simply sulking. She will return within the fortnight, once she has had her tantrum in private." The Dowager Duchess, who had watched her son's marriage with the particular sharp attention of a woman who had lived through several decades of court politics and had developed, over that time, a considerably more accurate read of Clara Delacroix than her son had ever bothered to form, said nothing in response, beyond a single, careful, "I hope you are right, Julian," delivered in a tone that made clear she did not believe it for a moment. The fortnight passed. Clara did not return. Julian could not sleep. This became, over the following weeks, the defining fact of his existence. The palace at night had become a landscape of shadows that resolved, in the corner of his eye, into the shape of a woman who was never actually there. Every carriage that approached the palace gates sent his heart into a sudden, uncontrolled acceleration that he could not master, no matter how many times the carriage proved to contain nothing more alarming than a delivery of wine or a visiting minister. The silence of the house, a silence Clara had somehow occupied even when she said very little, simply by the fact of her presence, had become, in her absence, a silence that pressed against him with an almost physical weight. Genevieve, when she came to him in the weeks following the anniversary dinner, seeking the reassurance and attention she believed her gift had been designed to secure, found Julian distracted to the point of cruelty, snapping at her with a rawness that startled them both, consumed entirely by a single, circling, unanswerable question. What was Clara doing? He did not know. He had no way of knowing, because he had spent 12 months of marriage never once bothering to learn who his wife actually was, and he was discovering, with mounting and specific terror, that this ignorance was itself the most dangerous position he had ever occupied. The first blow fell 1 month after the anniversary dinner, and it fell without warning, in the form of a letter from the Imperial Bank of Meridienne, the institution that held the bulk of Reinholdt's wartime debt. Julian's personal secretary brought him the letter with the careful, ashen expression of a man delivering news he understood to be catastrophic. The letter, written in the formal and unyielding language of high finance, informed His Grace the Duke of Reinholdt that, by order of the Delacroix family trustees, who held, as it emerged, a controlling interest in a significant portion of Reinholdt's outstanding wartime loans, a fact that Julian had never troubled himself to investigate at the time of his marriage, and that had apparently been arranged, with considerable foresight, by Clara's father as a condition of the marriage settlement. His credit was revoked, effective immediately, and immediate repayment of the outstanding wartime loans was demanded in full. Julian read the letter 3 times before the meaning of it fully assembled itself in his mind. He went, within the hour, to the head banker of the Meridienne house, a man named Voss, with whom he had maintained a cordial and mutually profitable relationship for a decade, and demanded an explanation. Voss received him with the particular discomfort of a man delivering bad news to someone he can no longer afford to protect. "By order of the Duchess's family trustees, Your Grace," Voss said, "your credit is revoked. They are demanding immediate repayment of your wartime loans. I am afraid the instructions are unambiguous, and the Delacroix family's position within this institution is considerably stronger than yours." Julian stood in Voss's office and felt, for the first time, the specific vertigo of a man realizing that the ground he had assumed was solid beneath him had, in fact, never belonged to him at all. 2 weeks later, the second blow fell, and it was, if anything, more devastating than the first, because it struck not at his money, but at the political alliances he had believed were built on genuine loyalty, and were, he was discovering, built on something considerably more fragile. He requested an audience with the High Chancellor, a man he had considered, for the better part of a decade, a close political ally and personal friend, on a matter he described to the Chancellor's secretary as urgent. The audience was refused. In its place came a note, written in the Chancellor's own hand, that Julian read standing in his study, with the particular numbness of a man who has run out of capacity for further shock, and is discovering, nonetheless, that further shock is available. "The Duchess has shared proof of your domestic disgrace with the Empress," the note read. "The court will no longer associate with a man who lets a mistress insult a daughter of our house." Julian sat down heavily in his study chair and understood, finally, with the terrible completeness of a man who has been slow to see something that was, in retrospect, entirely obvious, what had actually happened. Clara had not fled to Aldermore to hide her humiliated face from society. She had gone to the capital. She had spent the month since the anniversary dinner systematically and methodically dismantling every pillar of his power, his credit, his alliances, his standing at court. With the same quiet, patient, exhaustive competence she had spent 12 months of marriage demonstrating in the management of his household, applied now to the far more consequential project of his complete undoing. He had married a woman he believed to be gentle because he had never once tested whether her gentleness was a limitation or a choice. He understood now, far too late, that it had always been the second. Driven by a panic that had, by this point, entirely overtaken whatever remained of his composure, Julian rode out to Aldermore himself, alone, without his usual retinue, convinced that if he could simply find Clara, kneel before her, and beg with sufficient sincerity, he might yet salvage something from the wreckage that his life had become in the span of 6 weeks. He arrived at the country estate on a grey, fog-heavy morning to find the great iron gates chained shut. The windows of the main house had been boarded over, and affixed to the front door, official and unmistakable, was a large sign bearing the imperial seal, its lettering stark against the weathered wood, "Seized for corruption." Julian stood before the gates in the cold fog, staring at the sign, unable for a long moment to make his mind process what his eyes were reporting to it. A figure emerged from the mist near the gatehouse, the local magistrate, an older man with the weary, unimpressed bearing of someone who has, in recent weeks, grown accustomed to receiving visits from increasingly desperate and increasingly disheveled dukes. "Your Grace," the magistrate said, with a bow that managed to convey precisely the correct amount of formal respect and no warmth whatsoever. "The Duchess sold this entire estate to the Crown weeks ago, using her independent property rights under the marriage settlement. It was, I understand, entirely within her legal power to do so. She left the country shortly afterward." He paused. "She left a message for you, Your Grace, should you come looking. I was instructed to hold it until you arrived." The magistrate produced a sealed letter from inside his coat and handed it to Julian, who broke the seal with hands that had, by this point, begun to shake. The letter was written in Clara's elegant, unhurried hand, and it contained a single sentence. "You thought I was resting in your other house, Julian. I was busy turning your castle into your prison." Julian stood in the fog before the boarded windows of the estate that had, until weeks ago, belonged to his family for 4 generations, holding a letter that confirmed, in Clara's own precise and devastating handwriting, the complete and total scope of what he had lost, and understood, for the first time in his life, what it felt like to be entirely and irreversibly outmaneuvered by someone he had never bothered to see clearly. He had thought her gentleness was weakness. He had thought her silence was compliance. He had thought her patience, over 12 months of marriage, was simply the natural temperament of a well-bred wife who had nothing more urgent on her mind than the management of dinner menus and the appropriate placement of guests at table. He understood now that every one of these assumptions had been not merely wrong, but catastrophically, expensively wrong, and that the woman he had married, the woman he had signed a marriage settlement with barely reading the terms, the woman whose family's controlling interest in his own debt he had never troubled to investigate, the woman he had betrayed with a casual carelessness he had never imagined would carry any cost at all, had spent an entire year allowing him to believe exactly what he wanted to believe, precisely because that belief was the trap into which he would eventually, inevitably, walk. The year that followed was the year of Julian's complete and comprehensive ruin, documented in exhaustive and humiliating detail across the drawing rooms and financial houses of the continent. Without credit, the estate's operations collapsed within months. The wartime debt called in, unable to be serviced, forced the sale of land, of art, of the accumulated inheritance of 4 generations of Renholt dukes, piece by piece, at prices depressed by the widely known desperation of the seller. Without his political alliances, he found himself unable to secure the kind of protective intervention that might, in better circumstances, have slowed the collapse. The High Chancellor's withdrawal had signalled, with the particular brutal efficiency of court politics, that Julian Ashgrave was no longer a man worth protecting, and the rest of his allies had followed the Chancellor's lead with the swift self-interest of people who have learned to read which way power is moving. Genevieve Fontaine, whose vanity had lit the initial spark, discovered within weeks that a duke stripped of his credit and his standing was of considerably less interest to her than a duke in full possession of both, and departed for the household of a wealthier and less encumbered protector without any particular ceremony or regret. Julian, by the time this occurred, found he had no capacity left to feel it as a betrayal. It registered, if anything, as simply one more confirmation of how completely and how correctly Clara had understood the true nature of everyone around him. He spent the year attempting, through every legal and political channel available to a man in rapid decline, to reverse some portion of what had happened, and discovered, at every turn, that Clara had anticipated and foreclosed each avenue months before he thought to attempt it. She had not acted in fury. She had not acted in haste. She had, he came to understand with a clarity that arrived far too late to be useful, spent the 12 months of their marriage constructing, with meticulous and patient precision, the complete architecture of his downfall, waiting only for the moment when he would hand her the justification to execute it. A moment that Genevieve's vanity had, in the end, provided for her, gift-wrapped, on the night of their anniversary. He learned, from the fragments of information that reached him through the diminishing circle of people still willing to speak with him, that Clara had left the continent entirely, that she had travelled, with the trunk she had carried from the palace herself and the fortune her legal manoeuvring had preserved and multiplied, to a distant maritime kingdom across the sea, a wealthy, sunlit realm with which the Delacroix banking family had maintained trading relationships for generations, and where she had been received, by virtue of both her family's standing and her own formidable reputation, which had travelled ahead of her, with the honour and welcome due a woman who had just demonstrated, in the most public and comprehensive way imaginable, exactly what she was capable of. A year to the day after the anniversary dinner that had begun his collapse, Julian, bankrupt, stripped of his remaining titles by an imperial court that had lost all patience for a duke who could no longer service his debts or command the loyalty of anyone at all, arrived, travel-worn and desperate, at the gates of that distant maritime palace, having spent what remained of his diminished resources on the journey, because he had convinced himself, in the specific delusion of a drowning man reaching for anything within grasp, that if he could simply see her, simply speak with her, simply kneel before her and demonstrate the full extent of his ruin and his regret, she might yet extend to him some measure of the mercy he had never once, in the entirety of their marriage, thought to extend to her. He found her on a wide balcony overlooking a harbour filled with ships flying a dozen different flags, standing in the golden light of a climate that had never known the grey fog of Renholt, surrounded by a small gathering of foreign dignitaries and kings who treated her, Julian saw immediately, with the particular deference reserved for someone whose favour was worth cultivating and whose disfavour was worth avoiding at any cost. She looked, standing there in the sunlight with her back straight and her expression composed, and her eyes taking in the harbour with the calm proprietary attention of someone surveying a portion of her own domain, like an empress. Julian pushed past the startled guards at the base of the stairs, driven by an exhaustion and a terror that had entirely overtaken whatever dignity remained to him, and collapsed to his knees in the dirt of the courtyard below the balcony, shaking, his once fine clothes travel-stained and threadbare, a man who bore almost no resemblance to the confident, self-satisfied Duke who had stood a year earlier delivering a toast about his own magnificence. "Clara," he called up to her, his voice cracking with a rawness that startled even him. "Please, I have sent Genevieve away. She is gone. I have nothing to do with her. I am ruined, Clara. I have nothing left. I thought you were simply resting at the country estate. I did not understand. Please, please tell me how to fix this." Clara looked down at him from the balcony. The gathered dignitaries fell silent, watching, and she let the silence stretch for a long moment before she spoke, her voice carrying clearly down into the courtyard, calm and unhurried, and entirely without the fury he had, in some desperate corner of his mind, almost hoped for, because fury would have meant she still felt something for him worth the naming. What was in her eyes instead was worse than fury. It was a devastating, majestic indifference, the expression of a woman looking down at something that had once mattered to her and had, over the course of a single catastrophic year, ceased entirely to matter at all. "You were terrified of what I would do, Julian," she said, "because you knew, somewhere beneath all your certainty, exactly what you deserved. You thought I was hiding in your other house, because you could not face the reality that a woman like me does not weep over a man like you." She paused and looked at him for a long moment with an expression that held, at last, something almost like pity, though not quite enough of it to soften what came next. "I did not destroy your life, Julian. I simply stopped protecting you from yourself. Goodbye." She turned, without another word, and walked back into the warm golden light of her palace, the foreign dignitaries parting to let her pass with the deference of people who understood, completely and without doubt, exactly whose court this now was. Below, in the courtyard, the guard stepped forward and took hold of Julian Ashgrave, former Duke of Renholt, and led him, weeping, broken, entirely and finally undone, out through the palace gates and into the rain that had, with the particular indifference of weather to human catastrophe, begun to fall. He never saw her again. And so ends tonight's tale, The Smile of the Sovereign, a story about a man who mistook a woman's gentleness for weakness, and a mistress whose vanity handed a wronged Duchess the one weapon she needed and had been patiently waiting for. A story about a year of silence that was never surrender but strategy, about a woman who read every ledger, listened in every corner, and understood the complete architecture of her husband's power, long before he ever thought to look at her closely enough to understand what she had become. A story about the particular terror of the powerful when they finally understand that the person they underestimated was never weak at all, only patient and precise, and entirely capable of turning a palace into a prison with nothing more than the truth, correctly aimed. And now, our question for you tonight, the one we want you to answer in the comments below. If you were Clara, if you had spent a year quietly learning everything, waiting for the moment your enemies handed you their own undoing, would you have laughed the way she laughed? Would you have walked away in silence and let the ruin build itself, piece by piece, exactly as she did? Or would you have shown him mercy? Tell me what you would do if it were you in that story. We read every single comment and we love hearing from you more than you know. If tonight's tale moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe to Tales of Whispering Hearts so you never miss a new story. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the quietest person in the room is very often the most dangerous one to underestimate. Until next time, may you never mistake someone's patience for their permission. This has been Tales of Whispering Hearts.